right, it's time to do your chores. So put your headphones in, get your vacuum out or your dusting stuff or your Windex to do the windows, or maybe you want to change the sheets, but now is a good time to do it and actually also learn something at the same time about the Ukrainian and Russian conflict that's going on. I have been avoiding writing about this, tweeting about this, doing anything about it because I feel like in times of chaos, no information is correct. And so you should always operate on the assumption that everything you hear in the news is fake. And it takes a while for the dust to settle before you figure out what's real. And if you have been paying any attention at all to this, the Ghost of Kiev story turned out to be totally false. That was where they were saying there was a Ukrainian bomber pilot that had done a bunch of damage to the Russians, and turns out it was totally fake propaganda. So we have to be very careful what it is that we believe and share on social media right now because during the fog of war, everything is confusing. But I found this article on Tablet that for the first time, things made more sense to me as I read this. And so I thought I would read it to you and maybe you would enjoy it also and get more of a perspective on what's going on with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And I think we're not calling it the Ukraine anymore. I think it's Ukraine, but I'm from a generation that always said the Ukraine, and so it just it sticks in my head that way. So I'm sorry if I'm doing it wrong. Lee Smith wrote this article, and it's kind of a long one, so you can get a couple rooms done while I'm reading this. So you're welcome. I wish I had someone to do this for me. I swear, this is my would be my favorite thing ever. All right, anyway. Russian President Vladimir Putin chose this war, Joe Biden said in his Thursday afternoon speech to America regarding the conflict in Ukraine. That is true, but U.S. elites also had something to do with Putin's ugly and destructive choice, a role that Democrats and Republicans are eager to paper over with noble sounding rhetoric about the bravery of Ukraine's badly outgunned military. Yes, the Ukrainian soldiers standing up to Putin are very brave, but it was Americans that put them in harm's way by using their country as a weapon, first against Russia and then against each other, with little consideration for the Ukrainian people who are now paying the price for America's folly. And as a side note here, anything that draws attention to the utter disgrace that is both the Democrat and the Republican parties and how they do terrible things just to hurt one another and end up, interfering in another nation's safety and security is just it's wonderful. It's music to my ears to hear this being read out loud because this should show people, wake up, take the blinders off. Whatever party you're in, they're the bad guys. They're the bad guys. It's not us. It's not the Ukrainians. It's not the Russian people. It's the people running things, the man behind the curtain, and they are screwing everything up. And I love this article for this because it really takes it peels back the onion a bit to see the show that's going on and how everything that's going on right now is so politically motivated. It's all about staying in power. It's all about hurting your enemies. And it has very little to do with public safety. Okay, getting off my soapbox and moving on with this article. It is not an expression of support for Putin's grotesque actions to try to understand why it seemed worthwhile for him to risk hundreds of billions of dollars, the lives of thousands of servicemen, and the possible stability of his own regime in order to invade his neighbor. Yes, this is the same question I've been asking. Why would he do this? What does he gain by possibly causing World War III? It's a question that needs answering, and that's why I haven't been making any statements about it because I don't understand it. All right, moving on. After all, Putin's reputation until this moment has always been as a shrewd ex-KGB man who eschewed high-risk gambles in favor of sure things backed by the United States, like entering Syria and then escalating forces there. So why has he adopted exactly the opposite strategy here and chosen the road of open high-risk confrontation with the American superpower? Yes, Putin wants to prevent NATO from expanding to Russia's border, but the larger answer is that he finds the US government's relationship with Ukraine genuinely threatening. That's because for nearly 2 decades, the U.S. national security establishment under both Democrat and Republican administrations has used Ukraine as an instrument to destabilize Russia and specifically to target Putin. Mm. I hate the interference. I hate it so much. The older I become, I'm so much less of an interventionist. Like, I just want us to stay home and mind our own business. Can we please stop meddling in the affairs of other nations? This is how we begin problems. This is how wars begin. And America has been making stupid decisions. Okay, I'm moving on. I have so much to say about this, but it's a long one, so I need to shut up and keep reading. While the timing of Putin's attack on Ukraine is no doubt connected to a variety of factors, including the Russian dictator's read on U.S. domestic politics and the preferences of his own superpower sponsor in Beijing, the sense that Ukraine poses a meaningful threat to Russia is not a product of Putin's paranoia or of a sudden desire to restore the power and prestige of the Soviet Union, however much Putin might wish for that to happen. Rather, it is a geopolitical threat that has grown steadily more pressing and been employed with greater recklessness by Americans and Ukrainians alike over the past decade. That Ukraine has allowed itself to be used as a pawn against a powerful neighbor is in part the fault of Kiev's reckless and corrupt political class. But Ukraine is not a superpower that owes allies and client states judicious leadership. That's the role of the United States. And in that role, the United States has failed Ukraine. More broadly, the use of Ukraine as a goad against enemies, domestic and foreign, has recklessly damaged the failing yet necessary European security architecture that America spent 75 years building and maintaining. Ugh, this article is so profound. It's so good, and it gets even better. Moving on, why can't the American security establishment shoulder responsibility for its role in the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine? Because to discuss American responsibility openly would mean exposing the national security establishment's role in two separate destructive coups. The first in 2014, targeting the government of Ukraine, and the second, starting 2 years later, the government of the United States. In the last year, and this is so, you guys, I'm I should also hat tip to Mike Cernovich. He's the one that tuned me into this article. He retweeted it today on Twitter, and he's been really great following his Twitter thread about Ukraine stuff because he's been warning people, don't believe what you're seeing in the media because everything right now is going to be propaganda. And he's absolutely right. In the last year, there have been two attempted pro democracy inter elite coups in pro Kremlin states on Russian borders, Belarus and Kazakhstan. Both of these so called color revolutions failed, but Ukraine represents a much more pressing concern, especially given the country's push for NATO membership, which Biden officials, like Secretary of State Antony Blinken, publicly encouraged last year with no intention or possibility of actually making it possible. Yet rather than compelling the United States to rethink the wisdom of planting the NATO flag on Russia's border, Putin's escalating rhetoric and troop movements only made the Biden team dig in deeper. This is a game that Biden and key figures in this administration have been playing for a long time, beginning with the 2013-14 Obama administration-backed coup that toppled a Russia-friendly government in Kiev. This was the so-called Maiden Revolution, a sequel of sorts to the George W. Bush-backed Orange Revolution of 2004-05. Much of that same Obama foreign policy team, Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, Susan Rice, and others, is now back in the White House and State Department, working in senior posts for a president who personally ran Obama's Ukraine policy. What did all these figures have in mind for Ukraine? The White House and U.S. foreign policy experts from both parties are uniting in claiming that Ukraine is a U.S. ally, a democracy, and a beacon of freedom, which are no doubt fine words to hear when you've been left to fight Vladimir Putin on your own. But to understand what Ukraine truly is, we must start where all geopolitics begins, by looking at a map. Ukraine is situated between two greater powers, Russia and the European Union. That makes Ukraine a buffer state. Geopolitical logic dictates that buffer states cultivate and maintain cordial relations with the greater powers that surround them, unless they want to be swallowed up by one of those powers. That's because siding with one great power against another often leads to catastrophe. No less an authority than the prophet Isaiah tells us so. He warned the Jews not to side with the Pharaoh, a broken reed he called Egypt, which pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it, in the dynasty's conflict with the Babylonians. Isaiah was right. The Jews bet wrong and were dragged off into exile. Today, Israel is no longer a buffer state. Rather, it's a regional power. But geography didn't change, which means that Israel is still a tiny country surrounded by larger entities like Turkey and Iran. So, how did the Jewish state transcend buffer state status? Because it acquired what is reportedly a large nuclear arsenal with air, land, and sea delivery capabilities, the vaunted nuclear triad, which render it immune to an enemy's first strike and ensures, for the time being anyway, that Israel is no longer a stomping ground for empires. Conversely, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in 1994 in exchange for U.S. security guarantees in the event its neighbors, Russia in particular, turned hostile. What kind of strategy dictates that a state hand over its security vis a vis local actors to a country half the world away? No strategy at all. Ukraine was not able to transcend its natural geography as a buffer state, and worse, a buffer state that failed to take its own existence seriously, which meant that it would continue to make disastrously bad bets. In 2013, the European Union offered Kiev a trade deal, which many misunderstood as a likely prelude to EU membership. Young Ukrainians very much want to join the EU because they want access to Europe so they can flee Ukraine, which remains one of the poorest countries on the continent. The trade deal was an ill conceived EU project to take a shot at Putin with what seemed like little risk. The idea was to flood the Ukrainian market and therefore also the Russian market with European goods, which would have harmed the Russian economy, leading the architects of this plan imagined to popular discontent that would force Putin himself from office. Putin understandably saw this stratagem as a threat to his country's stability and his personal safety, so he gave Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych an ultimatum. Either reject the deal and accept Moscow's $15 billion aid package in its place, or else suffer crippling economic measures. When Yanukovych, this is tough, when Yanukovych duly reneged on the EU deal, the Obama administration helped organize street demonstrations for what's become the history's most tech-savvy and PR-driven regime change operation, marketed to the global public variously as Made in Euromaiden and the Revolution of Dignity, etc. I'm sorry, I have to stop right there. Did you hear what I just said? The Obama administration helped organize street demonstrations in a foreign country against its policy. Do we have any business, and I'm not just blaming Democrats because Republicans do the same kind of shit. Why do we have any business interfering in other countries' politics like this? Organizing demonstrations on foreign land? I don't That's like an act of war to me. I don't understand that, and I don't like it at all. To me, it's like, too much meddling. In February 2014, the protests forced Yanukovych into exile in Moscow. Consequently, Newland and other Obama administration officials worked to assemble a new Ukrainian government friendly to the United States and therefore hostile to Russia. I mean, and you have to ask yourselves, friends, if you're Ukraine, who do you want to be more careful of? The the superpower on your border or the one half a world away? I mean, ah, wow. I mean, anyway, moving on. In late February, the Russians responded to the American soft coup in Ukraine by invading Crimea, and eventually annexing it and creating chaos in eastern Ukraine. I mean, and I'm not suggesting I know anything about the right or, the morality of doing such a thing. But it does feel as if America forced Russia's hand because America meddled in the situation in Ukraine and requiring a Russian response. Like, if we hadn't done that, would they have invaded Crimea? It's a legitimate question to ask. Like, how much of this is America's fault is what I want to know. All right, moving on. The Obama administration declined to arm the Ukrainian government. It was right to avoid conflict with Moscow, though by leaving Kiev defenseless, it showed that the White House had never fully gamed out all the possible scenarios that might ensue from setting a client state on a course for conflict with a great power. Instead, Obama and the Europeans highlighted their deadly miscalculation by imposing sanctions on Moscow for taking advantage of the conditions that Obama and the Europeans had created. The White House seems to have taken a perverse pride in the death and destruction it helped incite in Eastern Europe. In April 2014, CIA Director John Brennan visited Kiev, appearing to confirm the agency's role in the coup. Shortly after came Vice President Biden, who took his own victory lap and counseled the Ukrainians to root out corruption. Naturally, a prominent Ukrainian energy company called Burisma, which was then under investigation for corruption, hired Biden's son Hunter for protection. Oh, yes, they did, and they gave him millions of dollars. Look it up. It's true. By tying itself to an American administration that had shown itself to be reckless and dangerous, the Ukrainians made a geopolitical blunder that statesmen will study for years to come. A buffer state had staked its future on a distant power that had simply seen it as an instrument to annoy its powerful neighbor with no attachment to any larger strategic concept that it was willing to support. Russia then lopped off half of the Donbas region on its border and subjected Ukraine to a grinding 8-year-long war intended in large part to underline Russian capacity and Ukrainian and American impotence. Ukraine then made a bad situation even worse. When the same people who had left them prey to Putin asked them to take sides in an American domestic political conflict, the Ukrainians enthusiastically signed on instead of running hard in the opposite direction. In 2016, the Hillary Clinton campaign came calling on Ukrainian officials and activists to lend some Slavic authenticity to its Russia collusion narrative targeting Donald Trump. Indeed, Russiagate's central storyline was about Ukraine. Yes, Trump had supposedly been compromised by a sex tape filmed in Moscow, but Putin's ostensible reason for helping Trump win the presidency was to get him to drop Ukraine related sanctions. Here was another chance for Ukraine to stick it to Putin and gain favor with what it imagined would be the winning party in the American election. This is jaw dropping, you guys. With the CIA's Brennan, and a host of senior FBI and DOJ officials pushing Russiagate into the press and running an illegal espionage campaign against the Trump team. Ukrainian political figures gladly joined in. Key participants included Kiev's ambassador to Washington, who wrote a Trump Russia piece for the U.S. press, and a member of the Ukrainian parliament who allegedly contributed to the dossier. The dossier, by the way, that was the fake dossier. That was fake. It was paid for by the Clinton campaign to falsely accuse Donald Trump of these, bizarre sex allegations, and it has been proven that it was opposition research by Democrats paid for by the Hillary campaign, and it was all false. The collusion narrative was also augmented by Ukrainian American operatives like Alexandra Chalupa, who was tied into the Democratic Party's NGO complex. The idea that this game might have consequences for Ukraine's relations with its more powerful neighbor doesn't seem to have entered the heads of either the feckless Ukrainians or the American political operatives who cynically used them. Of course, Ukraine was hardly the only American client state to involve itself in domestic political gamesmanship. By appearing before the U.S. Congress to argue against Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took sides with Republicans against a sitting American president, which seems like an even bigger potential faux pas. The differences between the two situations are even more revealing, though. The Iran deal touched on a core Israeli national interest. As a U.S. ally, Israel was challenging the wisdom of handing nuclear weapons to its own and America's leading regional competitor and rival. By contrast, Ukraine had no existential or geopolitical reason to participate in the anti Trump operation, which allowed it at best to curry favor with one side of the DC establishment while angering what turned out to be the winning party. Russiagate was the kind of vanity project that a buffer state with a plunging GDP and an army equipped with 40-year-old ex-Soviet weapons in a notoriously risky area of the world can ill afford, especially one that lacked a nuclear arsenal. And that was just only the beginning. Just as Russiagate seemed to be coming to a close in July of 2019, U.S. national security officials injected yet another Ukraine related narrative into the public sphere to target the American president. This one appears to have been initiated by Ukrainian American White House official Alexander Vindman and his colleague Eric Ciaramella, a CIA analyst who had served as Vice President Biden's point man on Ukraine during the Obama administration. When Vindman told Ciaramella about a phone call in which Trump had asked the Ukrainian president for information regarding allegations about the Biden family's corrupt activities in Kiev, they called on help from U.S. intelligence services, the State Department, the Pentagon, Democratic Party officials, and the press. Quick, scramble Team Ukraine. Trump is asking questions. In order to cover up for what the Bidens and perhaps other senior Obama officials had done in Ukraine, a Democratic Congress impeached Trump for trying to figure out what American policymakers had been doing in Ukraine over the past decade. As for the Ukrainians, they again put themselves in the middle of it when they should have stayed home. The end result was that the Ukrainians had helped weaken an American president who, unlike Obama, gave them arms to defend themselves against the Russians. More seriously, they reinforced Putin's view that, especially in partnership with the Democrats, Ukraine did not understand its true place in the world as a buffer state and would continue to allow themselves to be used as an instrument by policymakers whose combination of narcissism and fecklessness made them particularly prone to dangerous miscalculations. The 2020 election victory of Joe Biden, a man whose family had been paid by the Ukrainians to protect them, can have done little to quiet Putin's sense that Ukraine needed to be put in its place before it was used yet again as a weapon against him. From the perspective of the U.S. national security establishment, Biden's victory over Trump signaled that its actions in Ukraine would stay hidden. So long as the media continued to bark that the 45th president of the United States is Putin's stooge, no one would be held accountable for anything. Except, as it turns out, DC political operatives aren't the only people who can make history. Putin can too. And the people of Ukraine will come out much worse for both of their efforts. Lee Smith is the author of The Permanent Coup: How Enemies, Foreign and Domestic Targeted the American President. I found this article to be really interesting, and I do feel like I know a little bit more about what's going on in the conflict over in Ukraine. And I hope you enjoyed that because I found it to be super interesting. I will drop the link in the description so you can share it with family members or read it yourself again if you so desire. And I hope you got a bunch of chores done while I was reading. All right, everybody, have a great rest of your day.